and they are preventing me from having that experience of failing so I can learn from it. If I'm that person in the room, how can I approach that leader that constantly has that, well, I've been doing this for 20 years, we're doing it my way? All right, so before we get going, if you're listening and watching, please hit the like button, subscribe. We're going to be talking about some really awesome things week after week, and we're going to be publishing every Monday. So you can get it on your drive to work or walk to work like I do. All right, so today we are going to be talking about that uncomfortable situation where you're a very strong technical leader and you've been all of a sudden put in a management position. And the reason we want to talk about that is because the fallout from all these layoffs across tech, middle management has kind of been attacked in a way, and organizations are collapsing, forcing people that were generally strong technical leaders to be in management roles. And they maybe need some coaching and advice and stuff to get their feet wet. So that's what we're going to talk about. Jonathan, why don't you give it a start here and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, so there's definitely a difference between the individual contributor and the manager, right? So even though you might be on a team and you contribute and you're working together with a team, leading people is a different skill set. And it just is. And why we're doing this is because, quite frankly, especially tech people and as well as some other industries like finance and scientists and things, they don't really get trained on how to lead people. And there's a big communication piece. And what I've noticed over the years, Henry, is that these industries tend to attract people that don't really want to do a lot of talking. They'd rather work on their own. But it's a different skill set, and you're expected to lead. And you might be pushed into this because there's space and you're there, and you are some cases a warm body, unfortunately. But here's an opportunity. You want your career to grow. A lot of places, in order for your career to grow, right, you need to go into a leadership position. I mean, did you find that, Henry, when you were?
Oh, it was the it was a very interesting experience, and I'll tell you what happened to me. So I was at Amazon about 10 years ago, about 8 years ago now, actually. And I was very, very strong technically. And so I rose to become technical lead of my domain. And I really had never led a large engineering team at that point. It was always very small. And so the problem that I had was that I didn't know how to motivate people. I just assumed that people would be just like me. And so about a couple of months into doing that, I was saying, why are people not working constantly? And then why are they not producing as much as me? I couldn't understand why. I was like pushing them, trying to drive them to become better engineers because that's how I got to where I was. I made an assumption there. And someone turned to me and said, Henry, you can't expect everyone to be like you. And I distinctly remember that situation. We were like in the cafe talking about something. And I said, really? And that was like the one point where I realized that, like, oh, being a leader is not just pushing someone with my own beliefs, with my own idea of what technical excellence is to be like me, you know?
Yeah, I think part of it is where your values are. Like, you value maybe working 24/7. I don't know. Right. You're very driven, is what I've seen. And there are people on your team where, remember, they have a life outside this as well, outside their job and their own value of why they're at the job. You know, so let's say they got family issues, right? That they need to spend time more at home than maybe you do. Now, if you saw that back at Apple, what would you be thinking? They said, "Oh, Henry, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be available after a certain time." What would go through your head?
I would think they weren't dedicated.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It
When
really
it
was a problem. It was a problem, and I soured a lot of relationships because of that. Because I assumed that everyone would tell me how great I was doing as a
uh,
technical person, and then that shaped my leadership, uh, like direction, like how I approach things. That because I was so intense, that's what made me special. Thus, I should be intense to the other people. And I actually couldn't relate to anyone like that. You're right. Like, well, you have to leave early. That's weird. Or you're not working over the weekend if there's something very important.
mhm.
And what I, there was one another example later on after I left Amazon and joined Google where one of my colleagues liked to really think deeply about things. And so it would take him a little bit longer to produce the same
Mhm.
quality that maybe I could throw together in a short period of time because I either cut corners or I just took the first idea that I had. And he wanted to make sure they did it better and approach it differently. And so my initial impression of him was that he was actually being lazy. And it took me a while to really look back and realize that he just approached the problem differently. And
Mm.
that, again, caused poor relationships for me where we didn't get along very well. And it took me a while to, like, quite some time to really understand how to work with other people.
Yeah, yeah, I'm curious. When you did realize that, what happened? What was the end result after you did realize that?
Well, I felt terrible.
Hmm.
I generally don't have a lot of empathy. I've learned my empathy. I know it sounds may sound very weird, but being just such a technical person in my career, I had to learn how to be a good teammate, how to learn how to be a good leader
Yeah.
and work better with people. And I was saying this the other day when we were launching the podcast, in that I was a real jerk to work with. And when I flipped it around and dedicated my career to becoming a better teammate and a leader for the people that I worked with, my career accelerated faster than reading every technical book and becoming an expert, a deep expert in mobile development, which was what I was doing at the
Right.
time.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to point out something you said earlier, and really was kind of the theme in how you were approaching this. You assumed, all right. And if I could tell anything out there in the audience, don't assume. Okay, check for understanding. Henry will tell you, as I was coaching him the last 6 months, that was a big theme over and over again. Don't assume, check for understanding. Now, you don't want to check for understanding, say, like, I want to make sure I understand. I want you to understand what I'm telling you or what I'm thinking. That's demeaning. Come from curiosity. Hey, what do you think about what I said? Or I noticed, that you're leaving early. I'm just wondering what's going on, because my expectation is that you'll put in a full day or that you will get so far in a project. But I also would just like to know, because you are cutting out at 5 o'clock every night, what's your expectation of this job? And you don't have to share with me anything personal, but it would be helpful if we kind of communicated with each other and get clear on those expectations, get aligned, and then it's not a thing anymore, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't get in your way of that productivity.
That's absolutely right. I think expectation is the biggest problem that managers don't uh, set well with the people that they work with. I used to try to model my managers, assuming that they knew how to do everything right. And yeah, that maybe they would say things like, don't assume, always clarify. But what they would never do is say, well, you need to just set that expectation so you don't have that conflict. So what you talked about is where, like, someone
Mm-hmm.
would leave early. Since I or others didn't know how to go and be curious about why they were leaving early, maybe there was some other obligation or something like that, like you said,
Right.
it would cause a poor relationship where I said, well, then I'll just pick up the slack then, as opposed to having that conversation, because maybe they didn't understand the expectation for maybe what the project entailed or something like that.
I'm smiling because I'm thinking this expectation thing always seems to get in the way of relationships. All right. Especially in family, right? Think about, there's the old adage when you go to a Thanksgiving dinner, expect confrontation. Most of the confrontation comes around expectation because you have a different expectation for your family that you might have for other people, right? And that's what escalates it. Same thing in the work environment. Henry, you're really passionate and strong about what you do, right? You really throw yourself into it. So your expectation, if I'm hearing you correctly, was, hey, you should be like me. And that should thing gets in the way too, by the way. So the idea is in any new relationship, or if you're going in as a leader, couple things. First is before you even lead, work on building trust and respect. They don't have to like you. They don't have to do things exactly like you. But if you build on that trust and respect and create that, and it's a two-way street, by the way. It's not a one-way street. I'm the leader, so you need to trust and respect me, and I don't have to do that for you. It's a two-way street. You will be halfway there for what you need to lead. All right. And they don't have to like you as a person. They just have to trust you for what you're doing and respect you for the position you have. Right. And then the second thing, set clear expectations. Sit with them, sit with whoever in a one on one, say, hey, these are my expectations. What do you think? Make sure you always get that feedback. Otherwise, it's hyper opinionated. You have no idea what they're thinking. And then vice versa. What expectations do you have? And I know a lot of leaders are going, really? I have to like ask the employee or the reporter what their expectations are? Absolutely. It's a symbiotic relationship,
That's right.
leader and report.
Yeah, you had said something a while back that I want to bring up that's I think very important here is, and this was a really good situation. So you have two reports,
Mm-hmm.
and one report is maybe more junior than the other, and you need to give more support to the junior person on your team to build them up. But the other person that's maybe a little bit more senior and skilled, you can have less support there. If you don't, well, here's the situation that happens if you don't deal with it. They go and meet up in the cafe one day and say, hey, Henry's my new manager. He's doing great. What do you think? And he says, oh, he's always on my case. I don't get it. It makes no sense. And the other person says, oh, well, he leaves me alone. That's really interesting. And then you have this conflict because they don't understand why. So it's really important when you're setting that expectation. It's also the expectation of support you give them. Because as your manager, you want to be their coach and help them in their career. You need to
Mm-hmm.
make sure that you're both on the same level of how much support you need in your career to keep going, and that the reason that I am doing that is to give you that more support, and the reason that I'm pulling back from you is that we've agreed that you don't need as much support from me. So that way when they meet up in the cafe and they say, Henry's my new manager, what do you think of him? Oh, he's great. He gives me all the support that I need, and we've agreed that we'll pare it back over time. And the other one says, oh, yeah, he recognized that I was much further along in my career and doesn't need to oversee everything, but we have check ins along the way. And I think that when you taught me that, that was a really great piece that I never put together because I would not set that expectation. I would just do what needed to be done. And I'm sure that that conflict would happen in the cafe because they misunderstood what my intention was.
Yeah. Comes down to communication, right? When you're assuming you're not communicating, when you're treating everybody the same, you create these problems, right? Um, and I'm not saying you have to have, be a chatterbox with these people. Be curious, all right? If anybody's interested, there's a great book out there called Conversational Capacity. And it's got by author Weber. And what it talks about is about using candor with curiosity. All right. So what's candor? Direct communication. But you also want to say, whatever you're saying, put your why in back. It's really important. Motivators are connecting the work, okay, to the reason for the work. All right. That motivates people. Right. So use the candor, but then use curiosity. What is curiosity? Learning. right? So, um, here's what I think. Here's why I think. I don't know. What do you think? Maybe I missed something. And if both parties or in a team conversation use this technique, you're going to get to what's called the sweet spot. That's that point in the middle where you are getting as close to the outcome, the best possible outcome that the team with the two individuals want. So candor and
Mhm.
curiosity can work really well. Don't assume, going back to
Yeah,
that.
that's true. Even when doing engineering design meetings, and you're going to have different opinions to try to reach the right conclusion, oftentimes you may discount someone's suggestion and then they become very closed off. But
Uh-huh.
really, what you're trying to do is be like dive in to understand their position, and maybe they don't have this. You're like maybe I'm being more aggressive and diving, and they don't know how to we don't know how to meet in that middle there that you're talking about,
Right.
and so they become more closed off and detached, and then
Yep.
you really have to recognize that a lot to be effective. And I think that's really important for any lead to kind of identify is when someone is being more closed off and someone's being aggressive too. So I've been in plenty of situations as a leader where I'll command the room, don't even realize
Hmm.
it,
Yeah.
and I'll have
Can't
to
imagine
reflect
that,
back
Henry.
later. Yeah. Yeah. Command the room, and the conversation doesn't go where it needs to be. You don't end up at the right solution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing is make sure everybody's clear what's the purpose of the meeting. Okay. And stay focused on that. Um, we generally have a fight or flight kind of thing, right, going on. And this happens subconsciously. Either need to be right, really push their agenda forward, or not speaking up and kind of protecting themselves, right, because they don't want to be seen as wrong. So the more aware you are of that, and the closer you can get it towards the big picture or the purpose of the meeting, you can then change your behavior style to move towards that direction, right? Not about being right or about protecting yourself. Also, it can be ego based doing that. And you really just take the ego aside, turn it into learning. What can I learn from each other? All right. We're working together to find the best possible solution. That's why focus on the big picture, on the reason you're there. Don't get caught up in your own stuff, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
Um, and
So I
it
have a,
sounds like that's what you're talking about.
so I have a follow up question to that. So let's say you're
Yeah.
that aggressive person and you make that realization that
Yeah.
you need to try to include others and reframe your approach. Do you just go and change your behavior, or do you need to announce that intention?
Yeah. I don't know if that people would feel comfortable announcing your intention. There's a way to communicate that. One, you got to be aware of it, right? There's got to be, you got to kind of back down and go, oh, I sound like I'm really like pushing my agenda forward and I'm not really listening to anyone anymore and I'm turning people off. So I would say just kind of holistically, kind of take the approach going, hey, you could say, I'm going to sit back now. You guys heard what I have to say. What do you guys think? And what other suggestions might be out there? You could do it that way, but you don't have to shine the light on yourself. Just by doing that, people will notice and will be appreciative and open up, especially if you encourage them. And as a leader, I really suggest you do that. What they say, two minds are better than one. So
Yeah.
don't you want everybody's input? Maybe you missed something. The other thing I just want to point out, some people say, well, I've been doing this for so long and, I know, and I've done this before and I know. All right. And it comes off really hyper opinionated if you don't tell you why in back of it. All right. Being there for 20 years and doing it this way and it works is not the why. The why is why does it work?
Hmm.
Because that helps people connect the dot and understand, and then they're either get on board or maybe they'll bring up some questions.
Yeah, I
So
think what's going to be great about our future conversations is that I've probably made every mistake in the book, and so here's a really good example of what I've done in the past,
Uh-huh.
and you can tell me what I could have done better. So I would make those statements. I've been doing this since the beginning of mobile development. Like, I know how this should be done. And it took me a really long time to realize that, well, how did I get there? I got there because I made the mistake over and over and over and over again. And so the question I would have for you is, so I'm that leader that is saying that, or no, actually I'd flip it around. I'm in the room with someone that keeps saying that. And so I'm new at this, and they are preventing me from having that experience of failing so I can learn from it. If I'm that person in the room, how can I approach that leader that constantly has that, well, I've been doing this for 20 years, we're doing it my way?
Yeah, well, obviously, whenever uh, discussing things with leaders, depending on how their personality is, and yeah, take that into account. It's a little more challenging at times when you're challenging the leader, but you don't necessarily. I'm thinking here, you don't necessarily have to challenge him directly. What did I say earlier? Candor with curiosity. Candor is, hey, I'm not really understanding. I appreciate you've been doing this a long time, and you've seemed to, you're telling me you know what works, but I'd like to learn from this. Okay. What did you learn that you know this works? Be curious. Because when you're curious, can't attack anybody, can't make any, people will only feel bad when curious if they might not have an answer. But if you're empathetic in your conversation, saying, hey, I see that maybe you're uncomfortable with this question, or maybe you don't know the answer to this question. Um, and just be open with the people, and they'll appreciate it. But more than anything, be curious. Hey, I hear what you're saying. How did you get there? Does
What
that
about
make
the,
sense to you? Or
yeah, I so
okay,
what about the trust factor of this? So if you're the leader doing this to your team,
uh huh.
is that must demonstrate that you don't trust them? Well, and right?
It could be interpreted that way, certainly. And you really just want an open conversation, right? You want people to feel comfortable to talking with you. If they don't, then something's missing. You're not connected. And part of trust is being connected, right? Um, and as a leader, you want to be there to help. And part of your job as a leader is to help the people who you're leading grow and learn. And not always from making mistakes. That's how we mostly learn. But if you can minimize the mistakes, not by telling them what to do, but helping them understand what they might consider doing or approaching something to reduce the learning curve, to minimize it, and have them feel they're supported and valued. That's also part of trust.
Okay. Now, what about the situation, since we're talking about people being elevated into leadership positions, they were
Hmm.
their peer and now they're in charge of the team? Any advice there for someone?
That's a little more complicated. If you're on a team and you get promoted, and now you're their boss. I've coached a lot of folks on this. Um, Definitely want to have a conversation. All right. And I suggest probably one on ones is better in those situations than a team because you have different relationships with different team members. Um, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about empathy, about getting clear on expectations, on having a collaborative, trusting relationship, right? You know, and talk about the big pink elephant in the room. I mean, get it out there. It could be a situation where you say, "Hey, Joe, let's just talk about what happened here. I know you went for this job, and I went for this job, and I got it. And I'm not sure how you're feeling about it. Don't assume, right? Again, ask them. And they go, oh, well, I'm not happy about it. Oh, well, do you want to talk about it? And they might say yes, they might say no, but at least address it. And then say what your intentions are. Say, listen, yeah, I have new responsibilities, but I still value your partnership. I value you on the team. I want to work collaboratively with you. My intention is not to get this in the way of our working together. And then remember, always check back with them. What do you think? What's coming up for you when I say that?
Yeah, that's really great advice. Now, all right, let's dive a little bit into the one-on-one aspect because you brought up a good point there. In the majority of my career, I don't think I've ever had a manager that has actually had a one-on-one that doesn't focus on project status.
Yeah.
So what would your thoughts be on how to try to flip that?
Yeah. So as a leader, you have a couple different job functions. Okay, certainly one is the project, right?
Mm-hmm.
These are check-ins. How's the project going? What do you need? Are we on time? Are the deliverables going? What challenges do you have that you want to discuss? That's all project based, right? But who are you talking to? You're not talking to a robot. You're talking to a person. And people have thoughts and feelings and desires and goals and all that stuff. So, as a leader, you're a people leader. You're a project leader on one hand, but you're also a people leader. And I told you it's a different job skill,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the idea is that you want to get to that humanistic side. So lead with empathy first, right?
Yeah.
And part of your job as leader is to develop them, right? So develop their career, help them.
Yep.
So that's a different job skill. And that's what we're kind of talking about within the Leadership Lab podcast that we're doing here is to help engineers through that.
Yeah. What I think is really interesting is, and for those managers out there that tend to focus on, if you're listening and you focus on project status and one-on-ones, here's an interesting thing that you probably may not have realized is happening. If you constantly ask for project status, what you end up doing is running around trying to put together the bits and pieces. So if you're in a one-on-one and someone says, well, I'm blocked because Joe didn't finish his piece yet, the next thing you're going to do in your one-on-one is with Joe is say, Joe, well, how come you're not done with that? And he's going to give an answer. Then he's going to have to go back to like Susie and say, Susie, oh, Joe said this, so now you can go and approach it this way. Like talking project status in a one-on-one space is the most inefficient thing that you can be doing. Instead, what you should be doing is if you want to talk about the project, use that as the way to then find out where you can help coach them and develop them as a report. Mm-hmm. And so the way I would approach it is okay, how's it going on the project? They say, great. Any particular challenges you have? Well, now that you mention it, they might say, well, I have trouble with this architecture, or I'm trying to figure out this new technology that you're using. Do you have experience there? And I'll be like, no, but maybe you should go and talk to someone else. Or, hey, let's review this and see where I can provide you some support. That is the best conversation to have. So you're still discussing the project, making sure that they're moving along in it. But what you're then also doing is identifying areas of support that you can then help them grow so they become more independent and potentially speed up their progress or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's how I've always approached it.
Okay. How'd that work for you?
Good. My rule, when I would work with a team or have a new person join the team, the first thing I would say is that in our one-on-one, I would say, okay, well, how did your prior managers usually conduct one-on-ones? And every single time they would say, we would talk about project status and how I'm doing on things. So I said, okay, great. We're never going to do that. And they're like, really? What are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about you. We're going to talk about your career. We're going to get to know each other. I want to know the things that are important to you and build that relationship and build that trust and help them in their career. And I think it worked out really well. Well, I hope so.
What I would suggest is actually, in a lot of cases, make that a separate conversation. Don't put the project conversation with the people conversation. Keep it separate. A lot of times what I've seen with people going into conversations like that, leaders, they leave 5 minutes at the end to talk about the person's career. Make it important, make it a center of attention. So I would say separate those. And I think in future podcasts, we could talk about actually how to go about having those conversations, how to set it up, and how to help
Oh, that's a
develop
great
your
idea.
team members.
That's a great
Okay.
idea. And
Yeah.
speaking of which, we are going to be having guests in the future. So I won't give it. I won't give up the who the guest will be. Partly because we haven't exactly figured out when they're going to be on. But we're going to start doing
Yeah.
guests, and
Uh
maybe we
huh.
can bring on a guest for doing one-on-ones and get some other thoughts and opinions there. That'd be great.
Yeah.
So it's
Yep.
now we're at the point where we need to wrap up and remind people, if you've gotten this far, please, and you haven't done so, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and there's a bell button apparently too that I just learned about to get the notification when this podcast is launched. So please do so. There is a feedback form in the description, so please fill it out so we can improve on this, because again, we're doing this podcast for you, not for us, although I am getting a lot of value out of this. So but definitely, like, let's get some feedback. We want to know what you want us to talk about. Leave a comment, let us know what we're doing, what we can improve on. We'd appreciate it very much. Do you have any closing thoughts, Jonathan?
No, no. I again, I'm doing this. I want to help. I want to help the audience out there. I have these conversations all day long as I'm coaching, and this is a way really to get out to people in a more mass scale. So tell your friends, share it. We want to share the messaging, and again, as we mentioned last week, if you have any questions or comments, you want to reach out to us. Both Henry and I are on LinkedIn. You certainly can reach us that way, and we're looking forward to future podcasts. Give you some more information and hopefully help your career grow as from what you're learning here.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. And you have been listening to the Leadership Lab, and this is our second episode.